Welcome, everyone, to this very exciting session on the essential role of negative emissions technologies in getting to net zero. In fact, you could say it's not just an essential role, it's an actual integral role in getting to net zero. We have an outstanding panel of presenters today to talk to you about how we do just that, including through mechanisms that capture CO2 emissions from the air and otherwise permanently store it. We have a panel of net owners, negative emission technology owners, operators, corporate buyers, and legal and policy experts who are focused on accelerating pathways to net zero and enhancing climate ambition under the Paris Agreement. I'm here moderating with my colleague, Jonathan McGillivray. I'm Lisa DeMarco. We're both from Resilient LLP, and we are very privileged to be with such a talented panel. Let me start first with Myles Allen, who is a professor of geosystem science in the School of Geography and the Environment and head of the Climate Dynamics Group in the Department of Physics at the University of Oxford. Over to you, Myles.
Sure. Well, okay, thank you. And I'm just going to sort of set the scene for this. And I think it's fair to say that about 2 o'clock this afternoon, British summertime, it all just got slightly more real when a Dutch court handed down, if you haven't heard the news already, a Dutch court has handed down a ruling on Royal Dutch Shell, the oil and gas major, that their plan for achieving net zero was not compliant in the view of the court with the Paris Agreement, and they had to up their game by a factor of more than 2 and reduce their emissions, both from their own activities and the products they sell, by 45% from 2019 levels by 2030. Of course, I understand that this ruling is going to be appealed, and how exactly it's all going to work out remains to be seen. But it's becoming clear that for the fossil fuel industry, their plan, assuming they had a plan, isn't really working. The plan being to keep selling their products, wind down or divest operations slowly, and invest in nature-based solutions to offset some of the emissions associated with the products they sell going forward, and use that combination of measures to claim they had a path to net zero is certainly for some courts not proving adequate. And I think that's on that score, I would probably agree with the court. I don't think if I was looking at Shell or indeed any other oil and gas majors plan for achieving net zero at the moment, I would say it didn't really hold water. But that said, I think we do need to ask ourselves, what exactly is this ruling going to achieve? I mean, the court is quite strong on what it doesn't like about Shell's plans, but a bit vaguer. Well, to be honest, I haven't read the whole ruling, of course, but I've just read the sort of summaries of it and so on, knocking around this afternoon. It seems a lot vaguer on what it actually wants Shell to do. And indeed, one concern I immediately had with this is, as far as I can tell from the headline result of the case, Shell could potentially comply by simply getting rid of some of its fossil fuel assets, selling them off to, a company like Gazprom or Aramco, or which perhaps is sort of slightly less sensitive to court rulings in The Hague, and then carry on with business as before. I mean, the reason I think this is possible is that another oil and gas company in Europe did just this a few years ago. The Danish oil and natural gas company a few years ago sold off all its North Sea oil and gas assets to a British company, INEOS primarily, and have decided to focus on wind energy instead, and has always been held up as a sort of example of corporate practice ever since. But INEOS are still sweating those North Sea assets. They're using the profits they make from that to lobby against climate action in the UK. So it's not exactly clear what that whole transaction achieved, apart from making Dong Energy, renamed Ørsted, popular with environmentalists. So what we need is strategies for the fossil fuel industry to actually achieve measurable progress to net zero. And that's where I think the topic of this panel really becomes important, because if a company as its business model is still drawing fossil fuels out of the ground, they need to be showing how they are investing in putting the carbon dioxide back where it came from, back underground permanently and safely stored away for thousands of years, because that's the length of time it will continue to have an impact on the climate if it's left in the atmosphere. So, this panel is all about how we can do this, but the big, how we can do this technically, but the big outstanding question, which we've yet to resolve, and which I hope we'll sort of get a chance to talk about in the course of this panel, is how we actually incentivize making this happen. Because depressingly, dumping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere remains by far the cheapest way of disposing of it. And as long as that option remains available to people, then the incentives for getting rid of carbon dioxide safely and permanently back underground is not going to be there. And other disposal options like nature-based solutions complicate the picture as well. So we need to talk about the role of all of these going forwards and recognize that in the end, there's only one sustainable solution to continued use of fossil fuels without causing climate change, and that is permanent disposal of carbon dioxide back underground. And that's what the topic of this session is all about. And I hope that sort of focuses your mind on the need for this. And the question we're now going to talk about is how we actually do it. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Myles. And I should mention that we've got a couple polling questions that are popping up in the background as a few people are speaking. And certainly our timing could not have been better. Certainly this is a
I gave away one of the answers while it was going up. Sorry about that.
Huge ruling.
First faux pas of lecturing.
So we'll see who is paying attention, Myles. It's a good test to see how closely attendees are paying attention. But I'm going to pass things over to my colleague Jonathan to introduce Lori.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Very pleased to introduce Lori Guetre, Vice President of Business Development at Carbon Engineering. Carbon Engineering is working to develop and commercialize carbon removal technology that captures CO2 from the air at megaton scale. And I'm happy now to turn it over to Lori for her opening comments.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for your time today. Carbon Engineering is a technology company that has been developing something called direct air capture technology since 2009. We were founded in 2009 to try to develop direct air capture, capturing CO2 molecules out of the ambient air at climate relevant scale. And the problem wasn't that we didn't know how to scrub CO2 molecules out of the air. We've known how to do that for decades, and that's how we put people in spacecraft and in submarines. The problem was that it was very expensive, sort of on the order of $1,000 a ton. And we only knew how to do so sort of on a very, very small scale. So Carbon Engineering was founded to try to see if we could do that at climate relevant scale, so megatons to gigatons, and at very low cost. So for us, our target has always been a 1 megaton plant that will remove 1 million tons per year at $100. That's always been the target for the company. Fast forward to today, we are now deploying that technology with partners around the world. And we're excited that we have this tool in the toolbox. And really, you can think about us being founded as a backup plan. The world was working really hard on trying to reduce emissions with the hopes that we wouldn't blow our carbon budget and we could reduce emissions in time. And what happened in 2018, of course, is that the IPCC said, we're out of time. We need to add permanent carbon removal in addition to all of the other things that we're doing to work on solving climate change. So for us, as we deploy now, one of the questions becomes, how do you deploy this technology, which requires a lot of capital at climate relevant scale? And how do we have it available if the climate experts are correct, and we might need to do 10 to 20 gigatons of carbon removal by the time we get to 2050, in addition to everything else we're doing? How do we have that available? What markets can we do that in? And where technologically can we put that carbon? And two of the main uses are, as Myles mentioned, simply taking the carbon out of the air and permanently putting it back into the geosphere and sequestering it underground, as we know how to do safely. And the other market for us that's economic undercurrent policies is turning that atmospheric carbon into a low carbon fuel by combining it with green hydrogen. Both of those are big enough to pull through and help us get to that gigaton scale, and carbon engineering has been working on both of those. We produced drop-in compatible hydrocarbons, low carbon diesel, low carbon jet fuel to help decarbonize aviation. So we see air to fuels and the creation of those low carbon fuels as complementary to efforts to just simply take the carbon out. In the case of those fuels, what we do is then reuse the carbon in the air. So that's going to go through combustion again, but that avoids the need to pull more fossil fuel up out of the ground. So we're working to deploy that as quickly as we can, and are excited to be working with licensing partners across the world to help deploy the technology.
Thanks so much, Lori. That's fantastic. And we'll get back into the concept of from submarines to climate scale very shortly. Love the tagline. Next, we're going to go to Mike Kelland, who's the CEO at Planetary Hydrogen, which is developing the first scalable carbon negative form of hydrogen production through ocean air capture. And it converts GHGs directly out of the air into effectively an antacid for troubled oceans that are currently damaged by climate change. So over to Mike.
Thanks, Lisa. So as Lisa mentioned, there's a number of solutions that are emerging right now, and ours is one of them, that I would kind of classify as enhanced nature-based solutions. So these are sort of a combination of natural processes and engineered solutions that help to take carbon out of the air and permanently sequester them on geological timescales. And those solutions are things like the accelerated weathering of crushed rock, genetically engineered super trees, and various forms of ocean carbon removal like ours that seem to be emerging at the moment that are really interesting. So what our process does is we take a very slow, grindy carbon process that exists naturally on Earth. And in this process, which is the sort of the geochemical carbon cycle, rain falls down on rocks. And as it comes through the atmosphere, it dissolves a little bit of CO2. And that slightly acidifies that rain. And when that rain falls onto rocks around the world, which are slightly alkaline, it forms a carbonate or a bicarbonate. And a lot of that bicarbonate is going to flow through rainwater into streams and rivers and out to the ocean. So that process is now responsible for the 38,000 gigatons plus of carbon that we have in our oceans, making the oceans the largest store of carbon on the Earth's surface. So it's a really long and slow, grindy process. It removes about 0.3 gigatons of carbon permanently from the atmosphere every year at our current concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's really way too slow to make any real dent in humanity's emissions. But the slow speed is kind of its strength, because it also locks that carbon away for hundreds of thousands of years once it does sequester it. And so our process really does a very simple thing. We take electricity and we speed up that cycle. And in doing so, essentially how the process works is that we have a electrochemical process that feeds in those same rocks that get weathered by rainwater into our electrochemical process. And that produces a very mild base. So this is actually something that is so mild that you could literally drink it, and probably have in the past. And once we add that very mild base to ocean chemistry, we're essentially giving ourselves a massive surface area of the ocean for our carbon capture chemical. And we're enhancing that ocean's ability to capture carbon dioxide directly from the air and store it into bicarbonates. Ultimately, that has two really interesting effects. The first one is that the captured carbon gets stored away for those geological timeframes within ocean chemistry. So we get hundreds of thousands of years of storage in the process. And secondly, we're turning that CO2 into an antacid for the ocean. So we're helping to deacidify our oceans. So our oceans right now are about 30% too acidic due to the excess of carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere. And this really helps to level that out and buffer it for the variety of sea life that depends on a chemically balanced ocean. The ultimate outcome of this is that because this process is an electrochemical process, it does produce hydrogen as a byproduct. And that allows us to produce carbon negative hydrogen, which really commands a big premium on any well-established low carbon fuels market. So similar to Lori, we see that taking carbon out of the air and producing a fuel as a byproduct of that process provides us with an economic model that works today to take this to scale. Now, we're a lot earlier than carbon engineering. We're still working on our demonstration facility that plans to be built by next year. But the economics and the massive potential of the ocean to sequester CO2 gives us a huge amount of upward scalability in this kind of solution. So that's where we're at.
Well, thanks very much, Mike. That was understandable for even the 9 scientists among the crowd. And I really appreciate all of you for speaking clearly in terms of going through both the geological and the chemical underpinnings that lead to a commercial solution for removals to address climate change. Last but certainly not least, we're going to go to Stacy. And Stacy, you're going to tell us about why corporates are interested in this. Stacy is the director of the Sustainability Fund at Shopify, which is really kickstarting the carbon removal market by investing $5 million annually in the most promising solutions to fight climate change through its frontier and evergreen portfolios. I know that there are a number of interested parties out there that want to hear the why and the how you are doing that. Thanks, Stacy. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And thanks to everyone for having me here today. So before I get into the details of what we're up to with our $5 million annual fund, for those that are not aware, Shopify is a leading global commerce company. We provide trusted tools to start, grow, market, and manage a retail business of any size. And currently we have over 1.7 million merchants using our software in 175 countries. And what that means is that commerce is growing. And as online shopping continues to expand, so do the environmental impacts of that business. And that's why Shopify believes in taking actions to make commerce more sustainable. And that we're focusing on that because we want to help both consumers and small businesses protect the environment while still allowing independent entrepreneurs to drive sales and grow their business. And so in order for us to support entrepreneurs, one of the things that Shopify likes to focus on is thinking about what are threats to entrepreneurship. And I heard a previous talk by some climate scientists in North America talking about how climate change is a threat multiplier. And so what that means is the negative effects of climate change can exacerbate other stressors that communities around the world are experiencing. So if we want to grow entrepreneurship and have people build businesses and improve their economic situation for themselves, their families, and their communities, we also need to tackle climate change. And so to do that, Shopify launched our Sustainability Fund, which, as Lisa mentioned, is a $5 million annual commitment that we are putting towards supporting the most promising technologies and solutions out there that are available today. And what we're doing is we're not making equity investments in companies. We're not providing debt or donations. What we're doing is we're being a customer. And what we're trying to do is leverage market forces to kickstart the carbon removal market by creating demand where previously there was none. And in the process, what we're seeing is that we're able to, as a customer, support companies as they scale. And we're intentionally getting involved as a buyer because our participation and our purchases help to support research, build pilot plants, and develop monitoring and verification protocols for these emerging technologies. So we also have our fund split into 2 portfolios. One is our frontier portfolio, which houses solutions that are atmospheric capture paired up with durable long-term storage. We also have an evergreen portfolio because we recognize that we also need to focus on solutions that allow us to reduce our emissions, but we also recognize that some of those solutions may not provide the long-term storage that we're looking for in order to really focus on reversing climate change. And so in 2020, we made our first 13 purchases, and we're supporting 13 different companies across a variety of industries, including direct air capture, biomass, soil carbon storage, forest protection and tree planting, ocean solutions, as well as companies that focus on utilizing carbon and locking it away in products. So in addition to our $5 million annual climate fund, we also make sure that our house is in order by tracking, measuring, and reducing our corporate carbon footprint. And we also find that it's really important to speak openly about the fact that reductions in avoided emissions will only get us so far. And if we want to put our best efforts in to help scale the solutions that we're going to need to get us the rest of the way, we need to be open to taking on risk, supporting early stage companies so that research can move forward and these companies can prove their business case. And then what we're hoping in the long term is that these companies will start to scale and will start driving down that cost curve, which will make carbon removal and net zero compliant carbon credits available and more accessible to more companies around the world.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you so much. We're going to go to a few questions shortly, but first of all, over to Jonathan for some of the results of those polls.
If we could bring up the results of the first polling question, that would be great. And as a reminder, that was approximately how much CO2 does the world emit per hour on a million metric ton basis. And it looks like the audience is fairly well informed. 4 million metric tons of CO2 per hour. That's the correct answer, at least from our perspective. And if we could maybe go to the second polling question as well, we'll make it through that one as well. How long do CO2 molecules remain in the atmosphere in years? And we have a mix, 34% for each of 100 and over 300. Our perspective on that one is that it's over 300. So interesting results from those first two polling questions. As a reminder, we'll have audience questions in a little while, but maybe I'll turn it back over to Lisa to get us started with the first.
Actually, it's
or
quite
first few
interesting.
questions.
I might just comment that the CO2 molecules remain in the atmosphere for a variety of timescales. So
Right.
the distribution there is actually quite representative. We're all right.
Exactly.
We're getting very many questions from the live chat. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to pop right into that live chat. And the first question comes up for Myles. And there was a real question about the limitations from international oil company divestment strategies. If you could speak to that very briefly, in your view, what are the limitations and what role could removals play in that regard?
Well, I think, yeah, I think the measure of how much carbon you're selling is the wrong one, because it encourages companies to do precisely this. You know, they can reduce their nominal carbon footprint by simply getting rid of assets to other companies that care about it less than they do, or perhaps are less exposed to lawsuits. That's not going to achieve anything, as I pointed out, the sort of Dong Energy to Ørsted example. So what we need to do is to talk about a completely different metric of performance, which is how much of the fossil fuels you're selling is being safely and permanently disposed of. Right now, globally, that fraction is 0.1%. And we've decided collectively, apparently, it's going to be 100% by 2050. And we haven't got a clue what it is, never mind how we're going to get to 100%. We're going to increase it 1,000-fold in 30 years. And we don't even know what it is. We're not even tracking it. It's not even mentioned in national accounts reported to the UNFCCC. So that's the statistic we need to hold fossil fuel companies to account on, because holding them to account for their overall emissions simply encourages them to move assets around rather than actually solving the problem.
That's very helpful. We're getting a number of questions. I'm thrilled. Keep them coming. Certainly in relation to the third question, I have a question directly for you, Laurie. Do you want to bring up the results of the poll to the third question?
For question number 3, we asked approximately how much would it cost per year as a percentage of global GDP to achieve true net zero. For every ton still emitted, we remove a ton. And an interesting distribution of responses here. A lot of people saying 5%. We thought it was roughly in that range, although the answer to this question is no doubt subject to some debate. And maybe we'll get the fourth and final question out of the way as well. Will we ever get to net negative and start drawing down the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. No real surprise here, I think. A fairly optimistic audience with 84% saying yes. And that should launch us nicely into a discussion about what carbon engineering is up to.
So if just jump in with the whole panel. First of all, Lori, I'd love you to comment in relation to the GDP outcome question. And just to prep the whole panel, we had a question about the role of carbon pricing and what that role is in accelerating the uptake of negative emissions technology. So start thinking about that while Lori's chatting about the GDP outcome question.
Sure, thanks, Lisa. And I love the ambition of the audience that we're 84% say we're going to get to true net zero. So for every ton emitted, 1 ton gets permanently removed, and then onward to drawing down the excess CO2 in the atmosphere. So I love the ambition. And of course, it's related to question number 3, because can we afford to do it? So first of all, do we even know how to get to true net zero? And then number 2, can we afford to get to true net zero? And as an engineer, looking at where direct air capture fits, that was some of the early math that I did looking at abatement curves. And I just took the Goldman Sachs abatement curve. They've done a bunch of work under a carbonomics umbrella and published all of the data in their abatement curve. And what you'd find is that when we put together all the different ways that we're trying to solve climate change and reduce emissions, plus the potential to remove carbon, either point source carbon capture and storage or direct air capture, put it all together, we actually know how to get to true net zero. So that's good. Functionally, we know how to get there. Number 2, the abatement curve shows their view on the cost to get there. And back in 2005, 2007, when the Stern report was published, it said about 1% of global GDP. If you look at Goldman Sachs data today, it's actually 8% of GDP is what they say that would cost. And then when you overlay the potential to add direct air capture into the mix, you actually cap the cost of solving climate change, getting to true net zero at about 4% of global GDP. So the good news is that direct air capture versus today's known methods to get to net zero would actually help us save trillions of dollars per year versus known alternatives. Hopefully we have lots more solutions. Mike talked about another new one coming online that will help us get this solving for net zero to be even more affordable. So hopefully it's not 8% or 4%, but something less. But it's exciting to wrap your arms all the way around the problem, say, yeah, we actually know how to get there. We know how much it costs. We could afford it. We need to do all of these things as quickly as we can, and then also find better solutions as we go.
Excellent. We're going to go to, first of all, Stacy and Mike.
If I might, my view on that is the ratio is a lot more robust than the absolute amount. And I think Laurie's nodding at this. I think we can agree on this one. So you sort of halve the cost if you deploy direct air capture. I think that's a fair one. What the total cost will be kind of depends on what the future has in store. So but I think that broad ballpark of you cut the cost by a factor of 2 with direct air capture and permanent CO2 disposal is a robust one.
Thanks, Myles, for keeping us in the realm of the absolutely accurate. I like that, but I also love the ambition that we're seeing through the attendees as well. We're going to start first with Stacy and Mike on the question of the role of carbon pricing in accelerating nets. And just for the whole panel, Stacy, you're getting asked very specifically how Shopify was made or convinced to start the fund, and how should other companies invest in innovation and pathways to ensure that we'll meet climate. So that's teeing you up for the next one, but why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Mike in relation to the role of carbon pricing. Mike, I know you've got a good story there.
Awesome. I won't steal too much of Mike's time, but I think it's interesting, Lisa, those 2 questions I think are actually connected, because Shopify has decided to go out and start purchasing negative emissions technologies and supporting these companies. And it's not because we have a legislated or regulatory need to do so. It's because we saw a gap in the market, and the quality of the solutions that we wanted to buy to maintain our corporate climate commitment just wasn't there back when we established our fund. And so that's why we're getting involved in carbon removal with long-term storage. And that we've decided to do that just because of the nature of our company. We're young, and we want to make sure that, you know, we address these threats to entrepreneurship. And so it made sense for our business. But a price on carbon is going to do two things. It's going to make companies a little bit more responsible for their corporate carbon footprint, because now economically it makes sense. It's not just, you know, for certain companies where a business case is there, you're actually going to need to start complying. And then the other component is that it provides that certainty that a lot of technologies and solutions need around the economic side of their business. And right now, I would argue in some cases, the voluntary market participants like Shopify are picking up gaps where there is no carbon price, and we're paying that carbon price and buying that credit so that the other components of the solution, which maybe are a little bit more expensive, and maybe this is where Mike will jump in, but, you know, we're one revenue stream in an ecosystem that needs to be built out, and carbon pricing is a tool to build that connectivity.
Yeah, I fully agree, Stacy. I think that you put it really, really well in saying that, you know, as a startup in this space, if you want to get investment, you have to show a market. And those markets being, you know, strong markets, we always talk to investors and say, like, you know, eventually we'll be in the low carbon fuel markets, and that'll be the place where we're able to drive economics around a solution like this that allow it to scale. But companies like Shopify coming in early, because obviously these compliance markets have long timelines to get qualified for them, and you have to be, you know, operating a plant before you can really even start that process, really gives you the kickstart to be able to say, look, there's a market here today of companies that are forward-looking enough to be able to pay and who are interested in paying a little bit of a risk premium as well as a premium on scale to be able to help you to scale to the point where those compliance markets become viable. And that's where I think, you know, obviously carbon pricing, I think, is essential. You know, like if we don't have a price on carbon, then kind of what are we all doing here? And even if that price is a regulated price that forces an expense rather than being a market price, it's absolutely critical that we price the externality, or else, you know, we're not going to innovate in this space. We're not going to build. We're not going to scale. We're not going to do any of these things. But if we go beyond just the baseline of like, we just need a price on carbon, what that price is really important as well, right? And so, you know, one of the things we often talk about is that, you know, if you're paying too little for carbon, I think it has two effects. One of them is that you probably are paying for stuff that's not very durable, that maybe doesn't have the quality of a true removal. But the other thing that it does is that it provides a perverse incentive. And it's a little bit what Myles was talking about with Shell, where, you know, we have this, you know, ability to say, hey, I'm buying carbon to get rid of my problem at a lower price than it would cost me to fix my own operations. And at that point, we don't have an incentive. Like that incentive disappears to actually do something within our own organization, which is, I think, the biggest challenge, right? Because we all know that removals are going to be a critical part of the solution, moving us from, you know, now into 2100. And they're going to be a big business, lots of scale required to get us to where we need to be on climate. But removals are not going to fix the entire problem. We're not going to go from, you know, 44 billion tons to, you know, removing 44 billion tons. That's probably unrealistic. We have to reduce our emissions radically in all of the different parts of our economy. And if we have an incentive that says, oh yeah, you can buy carbon for $10 a ton or $20 a ton, we don't have an incentive to remove that carbon from internal operations.
Fantastic. Shall we go to Myles and Lori for their comments on the role of carbon pricing and accelerating nets? Myles, maybe you first.
Sorry, I just had a brief comment on this, which is, I mean, carbon pricing, of course, is a useful starting point, but it's very dangerous to rely on it. And just sort of picking up on Mike's point that all too often carbon pricing becomes a pay to pollute option. And, you know, people need to start paying to clean up. And we need to establish that, you know, it's only real when you're actually dealing with the problem, as opposed to just contributing a tax, in effect, to continue exacerbating the problem. You know, for many reasons, but a really important one being that if you rely on a carbon price to discover things, to incentivize things like air capture, then you inevitably wait until the carbon price has gotten really high before you get a direct incentive to deploy air capture, by which time, it may become politically very unpopular, or it may be too late to actually deploy air capture at scale. So we need, I think we have too many people around the world are thinking, certainly in Europe, I can say, too many people I think in Europe feel, the emission trading scheme, it introduces a price on carbon, job done. We don't need to worry about this anymore. And it's abundantly clear, job is not done. We need direct incentives to drive the technologies we know we're going to need in the future. So my view is they should be regulated in and not wait for the carbon price to induce them.
So carbon pricing important, but those complementary measures and funding is very important as well. That's what I'm hearing, Myles, right? Excellent.
Spot on.
Laura, did you want to jump in on that question in relation to accelerating, how do we accelerate nets and the role of carbon pricing?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important when we look at direct air capture to note that there are carbon policies today, so regulated markets that actually put a price on direct air capture and removal, permanent removal back into the geosphere, and the creation of a low carbon fuel out of atmospheric CO2. Both of those fall under regulated policies today. For instance, in the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, we could create a low carbon sustainable aviation fuel out of the atmospheric carbon, or take the atmospheric carbon and permanently put it safely back into the geosphere. Both of those count for a low carbon fuel standard credit. Both of those would have to be done in accordance with the California CCS protocol and also a US federal EPA standard for the creation of a tax credit. So there are regulated markets that recognize it, and more coming online. The Washington Low Carbon Fuel Standard just passed. It includes direct air capture as well. So regulated markets will pull, but quite slowly. And what's happening, what Stacy described is something we're really excited about, which is that the voluntary market is leaning in. And what we're finding is courageous leadership and pioneering, like Shopify is doing, to say, I'm going to spend some money on sustainability. I care about it. My employees care about it. My customers care about it. I'm going to spend some money here. But instead of buying as many sort of inexpensive offsets as I can, I'm going to ask a different question. How do I take this dollar that I'm going to spend and maximize my impact on solving climate change with that dollar? And all of a sudden it opens up this big door, and what Shopify has been working on for a few years, which is, how do I kickstart all of these carbon removal solutions that the world's going to need, that, as Myles said, that maybe the policies are creeping upward in price, so these solutions are there, and we can kickstart them and accelerate them. But we need to get started. So we're super excited that even if we're serving regulated markets sort of to do the lion's share of the removal, that the voluntary market and pioneers there are helping to accelerate the pace of the rollout of these technologies, so we can get the cost down, make them even more affordable and more accessible.
Excellent. A couple more questions in the chat. I'm going to throw it out to the panel again. So Stacy, we're certainly seeing huge interest in your fund coming up in the chat. In relation to environmental and social governance, many of you are in fact, or carbon engineering and Planetary hydrogen would be classified as ESG companies per se, and certainly Shopify has a very strong ESG disclosure and mission and targets. I'm wondering what metrics and milestones show with certainty that a company or a country either are meaningfully progressing toward their target. Shall we start with Mike, and others can comment as they see fit?
Sure. So, I think that I was reading the IEA's roadmap to net zero last week, and what was, I think, really interesting in what they were talking about there was that about half, a little bit more than half of the emissions that we need to reduce by 2050, they expect in our energy systems, which is obviously about 3/4 of the world's emissions, they expect those to come from technologies that are currently still at the prototype or development stage. And if you think a little bit about that, and you look on an ESG basis, pull a little bit from what Myles was saying earlier, but it's really comes down to taking, I think, a very much a portfolio-based approach. And I look at Shopify's approach and as a really interesting standard. And a little plug for the playbook that they published in the last I think it was this week, Stacy, that was published. Yeah, last week. Yeah, so just looking at that kind of approach where you have not only looking at today, which is how am I reducing my own emissions today, and like I said before, I think the metrics that you need to look at are sort of metrics that look at solving the climate problem rather than just eliminating tonnage of CO2. I think that's sort of a bit of a trap. You need to be looking at it from the perspective of, in our portfolio, do we have an element that says we're reducing emissions at a relevant level that matches our own emissions? So not just paying to pollute, as Myles says, but also how are we actually doing reductions internally? But also, what's the component that we're investing in the future? Because the real win is going to be getting to net zero by 2050, not so much reducing by 2030, right? So we've got to be looking from an ESG perspective at a portfolio of solutions and a portfolio of investments that drive us towards the solutions that will get us to, within a particular business, that true net zero by 2050, and not get distracted from that goal. So I think that's sort of key as a metric from my perspective.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on that question very specifically around pushing the ESG metrics? What do you need to really evidence progress? And then I have another question on the chat that is very near and dear to my heart. It's about students, and we have a personal commitment. We put a lot of non-billable time into students in this area. The question from a professor at the University of British Columbia is, what do we need to do to best prepare students in business and engineering, and I would add other faculties, to really help accelerate the achievement of the Paris targets, and in particular, accelerate negative emissions technology? So either question, take your pick. Let's go to Myles.
I just wanted to come in on the metrics question. Apologies for sounding like a stuck record, but the one metric that ultimately matters is the fraction of carbon dioxide that you're generating from continued use of fossil fuels that is being safely and permanently disposed of. That's what we need to measure. That needs to get to 100% in order to stop fossil fuels from causing climate change. And right now, most people don't even measure it. Very few corporates even report it. I don't think any corporates report it. So, that's what we need to focus on, because that way, are you succeeding in decarbonizing the fossil fuels that you're still using? And if you aren't, then what are you achieving?
Thank you. And Stacy, Lori, do you want to jump in? Jonathan, do you want to jump in?
I'd be happy to kind of put a different layer on it to go above and beyond the metrics. It really is about transparency in these areas. You can measure, you can buy offsets, you can do all these things, but if you're just reporting behind a checkbox of yes or no, we did this, it really doesn't get you anywhere. And so for Shopify, and from an ESG perspective, we're doing something that's a little bit outside the box. Like Lori talked about, it's how to spend our dollars in the most impactful way possible. And how we're measuring that impact is what kind of growth are we seeing with the companies that we're working with? So how are our 13 companies doing? Are their sales funnels full? Are they ramping up supply? Are the costs coming down? It's not so much about the corporate carbon accounting activity. It's not, measuring and then going, okay, we're good. It's about making sure we're driving that change. And when you go above and beyond just doing the accounting process, and you start to dig into the quality of what you're up to and sharing that and setting milestone targets along the way and disclosing how you're getting there and sharing your approach, that's going to really drive the change, I think.
Lisa, I'll jump in on the student question. And I guess, as an engineer, we like solving problems. Lots of people like solving problems. I love them. And solving climate change is this enormous problem. And we need an all of the above approach. But a few years ago, we counted up the number of people around the world that were working on permanent removals. And it was fewer than 200 people around the world were working on that. And we need, thousands, tens of thousands of people working on it. But this is where, and there's also a lot of climate anxiety in young people that they hear a lot about climate change. They hear about all the, kind of apocalyptic forecasts and that kind of thing. And so the data helps, the GDP data helps me say, okay, we actually, and all of the above solution, how do you put it together? We actually know how to solve climate change and we could afford it. And now it's just a choice. And we need to lean in and find ways to make it even more affordable. And so more engineering minds, more students working on all of these different kinds of technologies, whether it's direct air capture or ocean alkalinity or other ways to permanently remove carbon. We need all the brilliant minds in the world to help us work on it. And it's a really exciting time for students to be able to start to help with those current technologies, making them better, and invent new technologies that will help us get there. So helping to really tell the story in a way that people understand and have hope instead of anxiety, and also can come in and help if they're interested in it.
Absolutely. If I can jump in on that one too, Lisa, I think I was just prior to this on a call with our partners at Dalhousie University about, just talking about science and everything like that. And I think in Canada, we have a big focus on engineering for sure, but the climate is largely a chemistry problem. I'm an ex-software entrepreneur. That's my background. And I was shocked at, the difference in terms of the funding and sort of interest and vibrancy in Canada around, say, science versus something like engineering or especially something like software and ITC and stuff like that. And I think what I'm hearing from the professors we're working with is that the student interest is growing. Like Laurie says, that around climate change, there's so much more interest in chemistry and sciences that relate directly to negative emissions, which are the skills we're going to need in that space. But the policy needs to catch up. If you're a grad student in Canada, your stipend is after fees, it's something like $1,600 a month. Like, it's not even enough you may as well work at McDonald's. And so you have to be really passionate about it to make it work and go through that process. And I think we need to do something about that here in this country anyway.
I'm going to go over to Jonathan shortly, if I can, because he made the decision to enter into climate policy and that area of science and law. And I'm just noticing that all of us are science geeks on this panel. Each and all of us have a science background, I think. And that's pretty interesting in and of itself. So Jonathan, why don't you wrap us up? I think we're just about there, and tell us your story.
We are there in terms of timing, and yes, thanks so much, Lisa. It's an amazing field to be in, of course. I came up through the law school route, but I also have a background in climate science, and it's really exciting. And Innovate for Climate is just doing a fantastic job of demonstrating that. So on behalf of Resilient LLP and Lisa, and with thanks to Myles, Laurie, Mike, and Stacy, I'd like to wrap us up for today, and thank you to the audience for attending.